All right. So qualitative research is basically whenever we are relying on anything that is not math. Okay. So official data, secondary data, survey data, we can use math or statistics to qualify our answers, to actually see exactly what we mean by this. Because we're looking at things, if we're looking at things with math, we're looking at things like how many crimes occurred at this location? How many months did this probationer go before they violated their probation? How many instances of misconduct were at this facility? But math sometimes will not provide the answer, particularly to questions where we're looking at things like how something happened, why something happened, what process led to this decision. And this is something that's very, very difficult or even impossible to examine with something like surveys or agency data or experiments. And when we try to answer how and why, we might be looking at decision making. So how do criminals or potential offenders make decisions? How do they decide to commit this crime? How do cops decide to make a decision about whether or not to arrest someone? How do judges and district attorneys and defense attorneys make decisions? How do probation officers make decisions? And also, we're looking at how people behave in the field. If you've ever taken a survey or participated in an experiment with the psych department, you understand that you behave a little bit differently if you're trying to behave in a lab versus out in the real world. So a big example of this would be something like Code of the Streets. This was where a sociologist went and lived in a disadvantaged neighborhood in Philadelphia. He made observations of people's behaviors. He interviewed people there. And this was something that you could never get information about through just quantitative or statistics or math-based research. We couldn't figure this out with a survey. And this led to things that we are still using and applying to this day, things like street and decent codes, where people will abide by different cultural norms, and the idea that you can code switch. So there's a YouTube video on this slide that you can watch to take a look at actually how Anderson went about this type of research and the interviews he did with different representatives of the community, people who are police officers and community activists, and also people who live there. Did any of you get a chance to watch any of the YouTube videos I linked to this from Polygon? Which one did you watch, Zach?
He was talking about oh goodness, which one was it? Because it was all the same guy. Yep. But the one specific to this, shoot, I can't remember. It's not the Skyrim one. It
was a cat involved, or was it cooking?
Cat.
Okay, so the cat video where a video game journalist basically quantified his pet's HP was basically structured observations. He observed his subject in the subject's natural environment for a stupid reason, but it's basically the same thing. Elijah Anderson observed people in their natural environment, in their home neighborhoods, how they acted toward each other, how their behavior shifted based on who they were interacting with. Some other examples of qualitative research in the field would be something like Wright and Decker's Armed Robbers in Action. This is where these two researchers interviewed, I think, around 88 people who had either been convicted or were suspected of committing armed robberies in a particular city. And they asked them, hey, why do you rob people? And found out that A lot of them were doing it to feed a drug habit. Some of them were doing it because it was the easiest and quickest way to get money and drugs and status within the community. And then moreover, talking about why these people selected their targets. Why do armed robberies or armed robbers target people like drug dealers? Namely, they have drugs, they have money, they don't have guns, and they're not calling the cops. Seems like a pretty rational way to look at why drug dealers are often the victims of armed robbery. Going back to the 70s with Muir, he observed a small police department and basically categorized the different types of police officers into 4 basic personality types: people who are problem solvers, people who are legalistic, people who are ass kickers, and people who are absolutely worthless. And figuring out how to actually go about using these people's strengths in ways that benefit the department and weeding out problematic officers. From a more recent example, the Project on Policing Neighborhoods was a study done in Indianapolis and St. Petersburg, Florida, where grad students basically rode along with police officers for several months and observed their behavior and categorized that behavior into various categories. What was the citizens' behavior like? What was the officer's response? How did this lead to this other thing? Things like that. So different types of qualitative research basically boil down to 2 basic strategies. Either you're conducting an interview or you're observing someone in the field. So an interview is a conversation where the interviewer and the respondent go through a list of topics or a list of questions. And this type of research allows the researcher to examine more complex processes. For instance, how did someone make this particular decision? Okay, you can't really get at this with a survey unless you're basically tailoring the survey to the specific respondent, okay, which basically boils down to interviewing anyway. Field research is where you go directly to what you're trying to study and observe it as completely as possible. So this would be Anderson's approach of going to this neighborhood, and rather than just going there a couple of times, he lived there for several months and observed how people worked, observed how people moved, how their behavior changed, how interactions would shift between family members to friends, to elders in the community, to people who are feared in the community. All right, and we're going to go through both types. If you have very specific questions, like if this is something that's really interesting to you, I would highly suggest talking to Dr. Lin, Dr. Terry, and Dr. Key, because they are all specialists in qualitative research. All right, so with qualitative interviewing, you're looking at the subject's perspective, all right, their impressions, their past experiences, and you're basically assuming that their beliefs and their perspectives affect their behavior. So understanding how someone believes how they are in their community, how their morality works, what they think is right and wrong, you are assuming that that affects their behavior. This type of research allows you to collect very detailed, very rich descriptions of whatever you're looking for, and allows for very detailed answers to any questions you have. And this can run into some issues if you don't tailor what you're asking, because you have to frame your questions to your respondent. You can't just ask the same questions to everyone, because everyone's going to be different. You're going to have to speak their language, basically. So if someone is from inner city Chicago, you're going to ask them questions differently than if they're from rural Kansas, okay? And there are basically 3 types of interviews. First is a structured. This is where you are asking predetermined questions and expecting similar answers across groups, all the way to unstructured. This is kind of more free flowing. You don't have a set list of questions, but you have a variety of topics you might want to talk about. Making sense? All right. These interviews are going to be drastically affected based on how often the researcher is going to contact them, as well as the amount of rapport that the researcher and subject can generate. Like, you guys are pretty familiar with rapport. It's how well a researcher and a subject connect. How easily does a conversation flow? Kind of think of this as a first date, basically. All right? If you have good rapport with someone, you want to see them more. If you don't, you kind of want to get the heck out of there and never see that person again. All right? So being able to generate rapport with a subject means that the subject's going to be more willing to give you good information. You can't generate rapport with them, you're not going to get any information out of them. Making sense? All right. So when you make sense, or when you're after you've collected all your interviews and you're trying to figure out the different patterns of responses, you can look at them across 3 different perspectives. All right. Basically, you can use a thinking units approach, which is basically you're taking a look at how the different participants have described a concept, something like morality or their decision making or something like that, and you're looking for a pattern. If you're going the opposite direction with the sensitizing concepts approach, this is basically where you're taking a look at something you already know and seeing how the responses fit within that particular perspective. Making sense? So this is like inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is very similar to the thinking units approach. You're starting with the responses and you're working your way up into a framework, all right? With the sensitizing concepts approach, you're taking a look at something that's already existing and seeing how everyone's responses fit within those different approaches, okay? The grounded theory approach is kind of a hybrid of the two because you're looking for patterns that can still generate theories as well as any specific theories that you can incorporate into those patterns. For instance, Code of the Street incorporated a variety of different qualitative theories. Things like structural disadvantage, like from social disorganization and anomie theories. How do those disadvantages play out within the neighborhood? And then Anderson also incorporated the idea of code switching. This was more from anthropology and sociology, where people change their behavior based on who they were interacting with. Making sense? Okay. So that doesn't mean that you always have to go out and talk to people, because the other valid approach with qualitative research is observing people and describing what they're doing. This is basically people watching. So if you've ever gone to like Walmart or Dillon's or the mall or anywhere else and just watched how people moved, that's basically what field observations are. You can also see this as being called an ethnography, where you're trying to develop a detailed description of a topic. All right. And what varies about this, the different approaches that the researcher can take, is how much they're going to participate in the particular behavior. All right. Are they going to be a complete observer where they're just going to watch? They're going to be that fly on the wall. Or are they actually going to interact with people? Okay. One example of this would be Ruth Horowitz's research on Chicago gangs. She basically was an observer as participant. She met with gang members and said, "Hey, I'm a researcher with the University of Chicago. Can I come hang out with you guys?" And she did. She went and met with these gangs, observed how they interacted with each other, how they interacted with non-gang members, and how they interacted with people who wanted to join the gang. And this basically led to a lot of research into how gangs form and how they sustain themselves. Making sense? this choice about how to work within a group, how to observe within a group, means that the researcher is giving up something, or they may actually prompt the participants to react, because people, if they know that they're being observed, are going to react to the fact that they're being observed. If you've ever taken a psychology course, you're probably familiar with the Hawthorne effect, where people's performance in a factory changed because they knew that they were being evaluated, right? Similarly, if someone knows that they're being observed by someone who's looking for particular behaviors, they may want to help the researcher out. Or they may run into an issue where they don't want to help. They think the researcher is off base, they are embarrassed, or they just don't want to participate. So they may limit the behaviors that they perform. And this also runs into ethical issues. If you're observing criminals, are you under an ethical obligation to report a crime? Yes, no, maybe. Like, this is something that researchers run into if they're going to be doing observations. Because if you're observing a gang and you overhear a plot to murder someone, you are probably under an obligation to report. However, if you observe underage drinking or minor instances of vandalism, do you have to report? And that's the primary ethical, I guess, quandary that a lot of qualitative researchers find themselves in at the beginning stages of their project. When am I supposed to stop this project and report a crime? Or when am I supposed to intervene? All right. When you're trying to find people to observe and similarly people to interview, you can use snowball or convenience sampling. This is how most qualitative research is actually done. You start with people you've identified who have this characteristics. For instance, Wright and Decker went to the local police department and said, hey, who are the people you guys arrest the most for armed robbery? And they went and found those people and said, hey, if you know anyone else who like robs people, give them my business card and we'll pay them for their time. That's snowball sampling, and it runs into the issue of selection bias, where people who are participating are not considered to be representative of anyone who does that behavior or lives in that area. But you also have to run or keep in mind that probability sampling is probably not really possible for a lot of things. For instance, you can't really random sample everyone in a community to see where the armed robbers are. Like, that would just be an absolutely insane amount of people to sift through to find the few people who would actively participate. You're also going to have to consider the environmental or spatial conditions. Like, where are you observing from? How can you get your observations? How can you conduct these interviews? Like, Wright and Decker conducted their interviews typically in a car. They picked people up, drove around, and dropped them back off because they didn't want the participant to be in any danger, because they didn't want anyone thinking that they were ratting other people out to the police. And they also wanted to remove them from the environment a little bit to see if they can get a more honest response. Making sense? All right. So skip over this example. I will see if I still have the site, the article for this. This was basically a qualitative study where a researcher got himself hired as a prison guard. And he wanted to understand the prison guard role and how it worked within a prison, and published, I think, an article, maybe a book about it. I'll see if I can find it. It's pretty interesting. when you're collecting observational data, as well as interview data, you cannot rely on your memory. This is the biggest issue with a lot of qualitative data, because in many instances, you have to quantify or describe your subjective experience or someone's conversation about a topic. So this might be where a researcher tries to record something, record a video conversation, or use a audio recorder, or even just take notes. And this will depend on what the researcher wants to measure and what works best there. A video camera would obviously work great for capturing a lot of responses, but might be inappropriate, particularly if you're interviewing someone of a protected class. Like if you're worried about your information not being confidential, you may not want to record something, because then the police might subpoena your information if you're interviewing armed robbers, for instance. And a particular ethical issue with this would be, like, if you're talking to people who are committing a deviant act or a crime, any information you collect can be subpoenaed, meaning you have to turn it over to the government. Have any of you heard of the tea room trade? It's a hugely influential book in sociology concerning deviance. And basically, a researcher would act as a lookout for bisexual and homosexual men to go into a public restroom and have sex. And this is a hugely unethical thing to do now, because at the time, homosexuality was a crime. And more than that, it was severely socially sanctioned. If the researchers' data was ever public knowledge, hundreds, or maybe not hundreds, I think there were maybe 100 people in the 100 people's data collected. The researcher collected things like license plate data. Like, that would be something that, if it ever got out, would ruin marriages, would ruin careers, would lead to people being jailed or abused or victimized. And when it comes to things like that, that's something that the researcher has to very carefully consider. What happens if this information gets out? How am I going to protect the people who participated in this study? All right. So something that researchers can do is they can meld or combine their observations with other sources of data, like secondary data, where they go to the Census Bureau or the city government and get information about a particular topic. They can incorporate other agency data, like crime reports or police reports or things like that. They can also use qualitative data in conjunction with surveys. So you send a survey out and you also randomly select participants to get interviewed. That is a very common thing with a lot of different survey types, like victimization surveys. And this allows the researcher to provide a more complete picture of the topic itself. As far as the strengths of quantitative or qualitative data, with interviews, you're able to ask questions about how and why people behave a certain way, and this gives you more detail than surveys or just observations alone. As far as observational data, it's very, very flexible. The researcher is in control of what they're looking for. They can study things in their natural habitat and gain a greater understanding of the topic. The issues that qualitative researchers run into is it is extremely time consuming. Like, if you think about how much time goes into a specific interview, you're looking at maybe an hour per subject. And for Wright and Decker's study, where they interviewed robbers multiple times, you're looking at several hundred hours where two researchers and their research teams are basically just gathering data. You Compare that to something like survey data, where I spend, like for me, for instance, I spend a couple of days building a survey and I upload it to a server in SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics. I can gather a lot more data that, yes, is less detailed, but it's a lot more. Okay. You also run into issues with generalizability across both types of qualitative research, because you're only able to say that your conclusions mean anything for either the people you interviewed or the places you observed. So a big criticism of Elijah Anderson's work was that neighborhood in Philadelphia was unique. And it took replications where researchers created surveys and sent them out to these neighborhoods in other cities, these disadvantaged neighborhoods, and found support for Anderson's conclusions. Everything making sense? So bottom line for qualitative research, it is time consuming, but extremely beneficial to the field. We learn a lot anytime a researcher publishes any kind of qualitative work. And it's something that can guide future research, future theories, as well as different types of policies. So it's one of those things where a lot of people in the field don't work with qualitative data just because it is so specialized. It is so time consuming and it is very expensive, but it pays off in the long run. Okay. So anyone have any questions?